Good morning. Welcome to our Intellectual Property Breakfast Club. My name is Drew Clark. I'm the chairman and publisher of BroadbandBreakfast.com. We're a news and events company focused on broadband and intellectual property, and we're very happy to welcome you here this morning for a very exciting discussion about approaches by internet service providers and other countries to copyright infringement. Before I welcome our guests, I want to call your attention to a survey on the table. We do invite your feedback from this event and other events, and also encourage you to note our upcoming events. We have our Broadband Breakfast Club next Tuesday. We'll have a very exciting discussion about public safety and broadband needs. And then the next Intellectual Property Breakfast Club will be on Tuesday, December 14th, with the IP attaché from China. We're also very thankful for the support of our sponsors, Public Knowledge and the National Cable and Telecommunications Association. Please join me in thanking them. And we're really grateful for each of our panelists who have hopefully been able to enlighten all of us about some of these aspects to, I guess we could call it graduated response. It's also referred to as 3 strikes. However we call it, what we'll be talking about today is how some other countries have been approaching issues of internet copyright infringement, and how the telecommunications companies, as well as the media and content producers, are reacting to a variety of such systems. I also want to really thank 3 people who have helped make this possible. Sylvia Syracuse, who you've probably met. She's our Director of Marketing and Events, did a very incredible job in reaching out to a lot of people that we didn't know as well, particularly some of our international colleagues. Also to Sarah Lise Sterland, who's our Assistant Managing Editor and writes on intellectual property issues for us, as well as Nicolas Jondet, he's a PhD student. He is from France, and I learned a lot about Hadope from him, and hopefully we will learn more from our guests. So without further ado, first on my left is Robin Twyman, who's the first Secretary of Trade and Policy for Business Affairs and Agriculture of the British Embassy. And he deals with ICT and intellectual property issues for the British Embassy. Then to his left, we have Jean-Baptiste Sofran, who's the Director of Think Digital. And he brings a legal background as well as a public policy background to some of the issues that we'll be talking about, the French graduated response or 3-strike system, and will tell us more about that when we turn to him. In the center of our panel is Gregory Fraser. He's the Executive Vice President and Chief Policy Officer for the Motion Picture Association of America. And Greg and I were chatting before the breakfast about how MPAA is encouraging these approaches throughout the world, and we'll hear more about MPAA's sense of their possibility in the United States. And then next is Hervé Ranaud, who's the Managing Director of Items International. He comes with a background in the telecom industry in France and works as a consultant. As the Managing Director of Items, they advise many clients dealing with telecommunications issues, and was quite involved in the International Telecommunications Union's report, The Internet of the Future, the Internet of Things. And then finally, last but not least, we have Sydney White, who's with DLA Piper. And Sydney deals with large telecom and media companies on federal, state, and local level, and has worked on a variety of international issues, but can speak primarily to the U.S. industry's approach, to the U.S. telecom industry's approach to these subjects. So let's turn to some of our guests. Let me turn to you, Jean-Baptiste, to tell us a little bit about some of the background, I guess it's officially the High Authority for the Dissemination of Works and the Protection of Rights on the Internet. Tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. Well, you know, the three strikes law in France has been in the process of making for like quite a long time. It's something that began probably at the end of the 90s, I think. And just before that law, we had like, there were several laws before. Most of them were ineffective. So the first criticism that was done even before the enactment of the Hadopi was that it would be ineffective. Well, it doesn't seem to be the case though, because there are several differences that make it probably more interesting than what was done before. It's also interesting because it's a law that has been very debated in France, a lot. Like, very rarely laws are debated that much. And it even gave birth to a constitutional decision by the French Constitutional Court stating that internet is a civic right. And kind of like the question was that the question was to know if you can actually implement a three-strike approach without a judge in the process. And the French Constitutional Court explained that no, you can't. You cannot do that. You have to put a judge in a process because internet is a civic right, and also because you cannot presume people guilty. And so that's just to like sum it up, to show how important it was and how important it has been for so many years. So just after like discussing about it a lot, trying other options before that, well, finally the French legislators came up with that solution called the three-strike law. Or in France, we had several names. At first it was a graduated riposte. Can I say riposte in English? Yeah. And then graduated answer, because, well, it felt better. But the idea is always the same. The idea is that, you know, it's to try to educate the people. It's to think that if you tell people that what they are downloading today on internet is illegal and that their act is fraudulent, then they will stop. So instead of sending a lot of cease and desist orders, instead of trying to sue them in court, well, first of all, you need to tell them that they are doing something wrong. And so, well, the idea was you could actually ask copyright owners to do it by themselves, and that's what they've been doing for a long time, and I think that's what they're still doing in the US today. But we tried that a little bit with the previous law, and obviously people were not satisfied. So we decided to create a specific public agency about it. So if you want, like the Hadopi, the law Hadopi is about two things. One part is creating a three-strike legislation, and the second part is creating a public agency in charge of enacting that three-strike approach. And that public agency is actually very simple. It's 9 members and a small administration. 3 of the members are nominated by the government. 2 of the members are nominated by the parliament. 3 members are magistrates, and 1 member is nominated by an IP, I don't know how to say that, some sort of agency between university, stakeholders and other people. So it's 9 people in all, and well, the way they proceed is the following. First, of course, you need to monitor what's going on the internet. Then you need to know who's downloading illegal content. And then you can begin to make a link between their IP address and that content. And then you can begin by sending them emails. That's the first strike. If they don't answer to emails, or if you see that they go on downloading illegal content, well, then you can send them a certified letter, which is the second strike. And in case that second strike is still inefficient, then actually you can suspend their internet connection for 2 months. And that was when the Constitutional Court intervened and said that you cannot suspend the internet connection for 2 months. It can be 2 months, and it can be up to 1 year, actually. You cannot suspend an internet connection without a judge in the process, because that's a sanction. That's actually something that's harmful, and so you have to be able to control that, and people must have the right to defend themselves. And as a lawyer, that's something I can understand. And actually, we call it the 3 strike, but it should be called the 4 strike, because then if the internet suspension is not enough, of course, the idea is that in that case, you will go to court and you will actually sue them for copyright infringement. But actually it's not that clear, because you can, the thing is, like with the Hadopi process today, it did not happen yet, so we're waiting to see what will happen, but you can actually sue them for copyright infringement at the very beginning of the process. And so in that case, well, what is the benefit to people? You don't know, you see. But it's kind of, we hope that it won't happen.
Well, thank you. That's an excellent summary. So are we at the first strike or the second strike? I mean, have emails gone out? Have there been certified letters yet?
Yeah, actually, yes, and that's when the problems began somehow. Or maybe I should say problems, because it's not that big deal, but the thing is that it costs a lot of money. I mean, the agency alone has a budget of 12 million a year. The cost of sending the emails and stuff like that, it's estimated by the ISPs, because it's up to the ISPs to send the emails. It's estimated to be 60 to 100 million a year. And we're talking about an industry, I mean specifically the music industry, that is, in France, it's around 500 million a year in terms of global revenue, you see. So it's a lot of money. It's a lot of money, and the question is it worth? Is it worth that money? The fact of having an agency dedicated to that is a very important one, because it means that suddenly you have people in charge, and they can understand what's working, what's not, and they won't move. They will be there forever. You see, they will be there, and they will be able to study what's happening and what's a good idea, what's a bad idea, to change the thing, to advise for new laws and stuff like that. But the process in itself will probably need to be refined. Some ISPs are actually very angry at it and express publicly against it. And the benefit to copyright owners is not very clear yet. We'll have to wait a little bit to see the impact. Okay. But well.
Well, no, Mr. Renou, could you address the issue of the telecom industry approach to this in France? Tell us a little bit about what your colleagues and others are saying about this system, and what you thought of his last comment there about telecom industry approaches to it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. France, first in the last 10 years, has become one of the strongest countries regarding the broadband penetration. And 10 years ago, the country were late, and you know, I remember we carry on different studies outside France, in the world, and especially here, to understand the business model and to understand how it was possible to develop the broadband in France. And in a way, we succeed. We succeed improving or developing PPP between operators and public authority and so on. The market has been driven for this 10 years by two different kind of service. One is triple play services, and because about 10 years ago, a new player, new entrant, which is free is his name, decide to offer a triple play services for €30 a month. And it was very disruptive, because with this €30 a month, you could have a free telephone access everywhere in the country, around 50 channels, TV channels, and free internet. So that boosts the market. And the other driver was became around in 2000. Between 2002 and 2005, became the P2P usage. And at that time, when you check the charts about the consumption of data, the traffic of data in the network, you could see the high proportion of PPP, specifically during the night, and you know, the operator was not officially they are neutral, but in a way they were satisfied by this situation, because the PPP helped them to develop the broadband market, like the triple play, but PPP either, and especially for young people. But today maybe it's different, because I don't have the chart with me, but today the streaming usage is a big part of the video usage. So it's not P2P, and the law is made for the P2P usage. But now people more and more, they use the video streaming access, or the music streaming access. And you have a famous service in France, two famous services for music. One is Deezer, D-E-E, you can check it, it's D-E-E-Z-E-R, and the other one is Spotify. Everything is free. You can have all the music you want for free, and it's legal. And the business model is based on advertising, with a share model between them and between the owner of rights. But it's bring at that time it generate a few money. It's around, I would say, I don't have a figure with me, but it's I would say it's about 50 million euro, and less than that. And in France, around before the P2P, the peer-to-peer access usage, the market, the music market, was 1.5 billion euro, and now it's around, I would say, 900 million euro. So that's the impact and the effect of P2P. But the question is what we have to do. Once again, the operators, they are neutral, and in a way they are satisfied when people have more and more traffic and they buy more and more access. They are going to apply the law and to respect the law, to transmit the warning to people. But that's it.
How energetically are they going to do that, given what you're saying is that they were benefiting from peer-to-peer technology? Have they just stood on the sidelines as this has gone forward?
You know, it's like Apple. You know, Apple on an iPod, you can store maybe 1 million set of music, 1 million song. And that means if you want to buy it and to store legal music in your iPod, it's 1 million euro. That's the same for the operators. They just sell access, and the reason people buy access is because they want to use triple play services. They want to use streaming. They want to use PPP, and that's the reason.
Yeah. Before we go global or come to the U.S., my understanding was that the AutoPay was accompanied by a lot of discussion about improving the online offer and making there more attractive ways, a global license, if you will. Did anything come of that in France with the creation of Adobe?
Well, there were a lot of discussion about implementing a global license in France, but actually it's not the way it went, not today. It's quite, I mean, it's kind of happening slowly because, as Hervé Ranoux said, the quality of the offer today is very good in France. The internet service is very fast. You have the television with your internet. You have the phone with your internet. And people, they like it. They use it a lot. And we begin to have a lot of free music services going with it. We have Deezer, we have Spotify,
Free
we have
others. As in legal license services that
legal license.
ad-generated revenue streams.
Kind of ad-generated or freemium models sometimes, like for example Spotify and Deezer. There are others, but these two ones are the leaders in France, and both are European companies. And they, well, you can access the music for free, but you will hear like very stupid advertisements. Like one every 15 minutes. I have to say, like, I mean, the Spotify's advertisement are a joke. It's so fun to listen to because it's really made to make you stop them. So, and then if you pay, they stop suddenly. And the quality of the music is better. And you can use it with your iPhone. So you see, they have been trying to think about what kind of product to come up with. And it's beginning to work, but it's not a global license in the
compulsory license.
Yeah, it's not compulsory. Okay. It's just an agreement between them and the shareholders.
Let's turn to Greg Fraser of MPAA. When you look at developments like what we just talked about in France, and I understand South Korea, Taiwan, both have their own graduated response laws. We'll hear about the United Kingdom in a moment. What does the MPAA feel about this trend? Is it too strong to call it? Do you think that there is a trend going on?
One of my, I had a friend, and he was a journalist, and he said to us, one is an example, two is a trend. So I would say that, you know, as we look at sort of this problem and this issue and look at it globally over the last couple of years, I think a couple of things stand out. One, the nature of online infringement is changing. We're just talking about the change from peer-to-peer to streaming. So that presents a new environment, a new set of complications. This is frequently and commonly called a three strikes approach. And I think that's a little bit of a misnomer. It's not the way that we look at it. But we do look at it in terms of, as was described in France, as a graduated process. And also importantly, this is going directly to consumers who are involved in this activity. And as was indicated, I think a key feature in all of these programs, and certainly in France, is education, getting directly to consumers and to end users. And that is sort of addressing the demand side of the problem. While there still is, we are increasingly looking at the supply side, or the other side of the equation. But if you come back to this and you look over the last couple of years, while a lot of the attention, rightfully so, has been on France and on the UK, actually the first government in the world to have a system like this was New Zealand, and enacted it about 2 years ago. It was on the eve of implementation, and for a variety of reasons they pulled back. It was just last week the New Zealand Parliament Special Committee issued its report, and they are going to proceed with a France-UK model legislation. You mentioned Taiwan. That law is in place. It's not implemented yet. There is a modest program in Korea, and the Korea internet environment is a little bit different, and so that legislation is modeled on the Korean system. There is a, not legislated, but a voluntary program with rights holders, ISPs, and the government. It's very modest, but it's operating in Japan. So there are similarities in what different countries are doing on this problem, but there are also variations based on local business models, local political considerations, local cultural considerations. But again, as I started, I would say that if you step back, and look over the last couple of years, you will see a growing global awareness that something's got to be done to stop this proliferation, this explosion of illegal content online. It is a real threat to the creative industries around the world. The member companies that I work for, as well as the other creative industries, whether they're in France, New Zealand, or what have you. And it's not just in movies, but it's in all the creative industries.
Something that Jean-Baptiste, sorry to jump in here, mentioned was that in France this actually prompted a debate about, is the internet a fundamental right, and does a judge need to be involved? And they concluded yes, there needed to be a judicial agency set up to deal with this. Now, what do you think about that? Do you view that in the same way, or would you be perfectly happy for your member companies or recording industry companies to be able to go directly to the ISP and say, 3 strikes, 4 strikes, 10 strikes, we'd like you to cut them off?
Well, I would say a couple of things about that. One, first of all, most ISPs, your agreement with your ISP has a clause in it that says you can't do certain things. One of those clauses is you can't use your internet service to infringe copyright. So you already have an agreement with your ISP that says you're not supposed to be doing that. Your ISP can also shut you off if you don't pay your bills. And, with respect to a judge, rights holders and content owners, they always have the right, under virtually every copyright law in the world, to take a legal action against somebody who's infringing their copyright. So that always remains an option. It's not always the most efficient, most effective option, but it is there. If you look at whether you call it 3 strikes or you call it graduated response, it is, if you will, a system which gives the end user, the infringer, the ability to take action before the internet service is either suspended, terminated, or something else. There's 1 notice, there's 2 notices, there's 3 notices. So there are these safeguards built into the system. And, most governments are looking at this. Maybe there ought to be another safeguard built into it, so where customers or end users have the right to avail themselves of some adjudicatory body to appeal.
Hervé.
Yes, just a point. In France, during the discussion about the law, there were a specific point which was very important. Everybody agrees that would be possible to cut the internet access, but technically it's absolutely impossible. For example, if you have a kid who are going to infringe the law and to have peer-to-peer usage, are you going to cut the telephone for the family? Because that's the same line. It's just a triple play services, and if you want to cut internet access, at the end you cut the line for the family. And that's the reason why it was very difficult to find out an issue to this point.
Well, yet it has been passed, and obviously we're still waiting to see what the consequence. Did you have another point before we go across the channel to England?
Yeah, there is a very important point to actually making it somehow, pass me the word, legal. It's that when you ask the ISP to send notices, well, actually they do it because it's a law. You see, it's not like they cannot discuss or negotiate or something like that. It just happened in France like 1 month at the very beginning. One of the French ISPs said that he would not send the notices because he was not, the legal context wasn't precise enough and everything like that. Well, they just precised it very quickly, and then he had to send it. That's it. And so making it legal actually helps, like, solving these kind of problems and trying to find a common ground. And it's also very important for the families, because just as Hervé said, if you cut the line because your kid is downloading, how will you pay your taxes now?
Right.
You see.
Tell us a little bit about the United Kingdom's system here, Robin.
Thanks very much. Hope everybody can hear me. Pleasure to be here, and I thought what I'd do is just introduce with a little bit of context of what's driving the UK's approach, and then explain what is the Digital Economy Act. The context is that the new government has come in with a very ambitious economic agenda, and he wants to see a private sector-led economic recovery. Now, when you look at the UK economy, the creative industries are a very important part of that. They contribute 6% to our GDP, 4% to our exports, employ 1.1 million people directly, and a further 800,000 people are employed in creative jobs in other businesses. But the digital economy brings not only opportunities, but it does bring risks. And the industry has estimated that unlawful file sharing and online copyright infringement is costing the creative industries in the UK about £400 million a year, with 7 million people doing online illegal file sharing. So the British government wants to help the creative industries in the UK reduce that loss of income. So the Digital Economy Act, which was passed in May this year, includes copyright infringement regulations. We believe it's good for business, and we believe it's the right thing to do. And here's how it works. Here are the key steps. First of all, the copyright holder is able to identify, through looking at file sharing websites and other things, who is illegally obtaining their material and who is sharing it with whom, and they can identify the IP address. They are then able to give that IP address, together with the time of day when the file sharing may have occurred, to the internet service provider. The internet service providers are then able to use their own information to contact the subscriber and warn them of what they're doing. The ISPs also have an obligation to keep a record of all the notification letters they send out, and compile a list of the most serious infringers. And an important point here is that no personal data ever exchanges hands without a court order. If a copyright holder wants to pursue the person doing the infringing and take legal action against them, then they need a court order to get that personal data from the ISP. And this graduated response built into the Digital Economy Act does give the Secretary of State reserve powers to introduce regulations for other measures, such as technical solutions like suspending accounts, or for blocking websites where copyright holders believe that these websites, such as cyber lockers, are being used to seriously infringe copyright. Those regulations are not in place yet, no immediate steps to do so, but we've got those reserve powers if we need to. And the most important action for us at the moment is to help copyright holders take targeted action against those who are harming their business. And when it comes down to the benefits, Jean-Baptiste and Hervé were talking about whether the cost benefit was working in France. In the UK, we estimate, or rather Ofcom, the UK's telecoms regulator, has estimated the benefits from these steps that they're taking at the moment should see up to £200 million in gains for the copyright holders. That's against estimated costs of around £30 million. Split between ISPs, copyright holders, and taking account of Ofcom's own costs. There is an appeal system built into it where people can appeal against where they believe they've been accused mistakenly of online infringement, and those costs take account of that. The regulations will come into effect, or should be implemented by March 2011, but ultimately, as colleagues have said, the success will be judged by whether copyright holders are willing to use that system.
So nothing yet, it's still kind of pending implementation phase at this point.
They're going through the consultation process on establishing the costs. They've notified the structure of the costs that will be charged to copyright holders and ISPs to the European Commission under the Technical Services Directive, and there's a standstill period until December for that. And Ofcom is also consulting on the specific regulations, what is known as the Initial Obligations Code. So that will spell out exactly how notifications work, exactly what body of evidence are required, and so forth. So we believe we're on schedule for it to be implemented March next year.
Okay. Let's turn to Sydney White and ask, based on what you've heard, how different are these approaches from the the Digital Millennium Copyright Act's notice and takedown system, which is pretty much the framework in which ISPs and content holders are interacting on this topic.
Well, I'd say that U.S. service providers now have undertaken notice forwarding, and if you look at the aggregate data from these providers, the large portion of the notices are first-time notices, and the percentage of second-time notices is significantly lower, and subsequent notices are a very, very small percentage. Notice forwarding also, much like Three Strikes, does have an educational component with users. You could have a family where the child was illegally downloading music and the parents wouldn't know. If their internet access was cut off, I mean, that could have devastating consequences for the family, but if you provide them with the tools to understand what's going on, uninstall whatever software is allowing them to download this music or stream music illegally, then that can have. I mean, it's a much more common sense approach. And then, in terms of Wi-Fi and other unsecure wireless connections, if you impose an obligation on the operators of a Wi-Fi hotspot or someone who just has an insecure wireless network in their home, which is being used by someone else to download music, those people don't have the tools to implement a system to stop that, and it shouldn't be those people's responsibility, and there shouldn't be any consequences such as having their internet access shut down.
Speak a little bit more about the notice forwarding that's engaged in. Is this done? Are we talking about anything for which there needs to be legislation? What's the framework for this activity? The content holder we're talking about under DMCA or?
I'm talking more about a business-to-business framework that has been worked out with various rights holders who will forward on information to an internet provider saying that certain users are downloading content, and that notice will be forwarded on to the user, and the user won't be identified to the content holder.
Right, and so these are voluntary agreements that telecommunications companies and content companies have entered into. What happens when you get to the second or third response? What's the telecommunications company's approach?
I mean, I think that depending on the company, I mean, there could be some sort of graduated response, such as temporarily limiting the amount of capacity that they have on their internet connection, for instance, would be a lot less devastating consequence for someone.
And the user knows that their performance is being degraded because of a copyright issue, or is it just a kind of?
Yes, that's my understanding. Is that again, it would be accompanied by some educational outreach to teach people about how they are breaking the law and how what they need to do in order to not continue with that behavior.
And can you highlight any of these as good examples, any of these agreements that have come forward? Are these working in your opinion?
Yes, I mean, I think the fact that the vast majority of the notices are first-time notices. Yeah. I think that it's a significant factor.
It's an educational issue. Please, Jean-Baptiste.
Yeah, I just had an idea because I would like to make a parallel between the British and the French experience, because there is a very, very strange byproduct of the three-strike law that's beginning to happen. I was thinking, because just like last week, David Cameron actually made a statement explaining that he would probably have to review the copyright law in the UK in order to make it less favorable to innovation somehow. Because the thing is like, actually we begin to understand that the core of the debate is not so much about what is, how to define copyright in 2010, but rather how to define fair use in the digital age. What is authorized and what is not, what is illegal content. Because you see, the thing is like, as soon as you begin to monitor and report, I mean, really seriously, you realize that it's not, well, you cannot really sue half of your population all of a sudden. And in France, we are speaking about tens of thousands of letters sent every week. You see, when it works. So it means millions of letters sent. And it means also millions of euros in functioning, which means new taxes, which actually begin concrete the day you have them on your bill when you pay for your internet connection. And then what was once a private matter somehow between a copyright owner and a copyright infringer suddenly becomes a public problem with tons of people doing something and realizing that they are all doing it together at the same time, and actually copyright owners who wants to get a benefit from their work and beginning to understand that maybe it won't be exactly the same way as what was done before. But it was very important to actually materialize this, this abstract idea that people are downloading on internet and making it real by suddenly having a process so that, okay, you download, we'll see how we'll treat that. But suddenly you realize that it's big. And maybe other things are, I mean, people on the opposite side are also beginning to get organized and defend themselves.
We want to get your questions in, but I want to ask Greg a question, and please elaborate on it with your thoughts on other subjects too. What are the pros and cons of going down the route of having a specific system and process in place versus what we've heard already, private agreements between content and telecommunications providers?
Well, I would say a couple of things. As I tried to illustrate earlier, different economies, different cultures are approaching this problem somewhat differently. But the foundation is there is a recognition that this illegal behavior online is a threat to the creative community and all of the jobs and the men and women who depend on that community. And so governments have stepped up and said it's in our national interest to protect that, to protect those jobs, to protect the French creative community, the UK creative community, what have you. That's a fundamental principle that we believe is very important, but also very healthy. Having said that, as Sydney was indicating, our member companies are engaged with their counterparts at ISPs in doing this voluntarily. I don't think our approach is neither a cookie cutter approach everywhere, nor is it an approach that it has to be done by government mandate or government fiat. In fact, where it can work between private parties who've got a mutual business interest, that's perfectly acceptable to us. I'm not sure I heard or understood the point correctly. I would not say that the proliferation of illegal content online raises anew the issue of fair use. I would submit that that line is still as bright and as sharp as ever. We have a new phenomenon. People look at the online environment much different than they do at Blockbuster or elsewhere, and they believe somehow the notion of taking something illegally off the internet does not carry the same weight, the same effect as it does as if you walk into a store and put a DVD in your pocket and walk out. Our view is that you don't throw up your hands at that and then change the copyright law. In the United States, we had a problem with smoking, we have a problem with drunk driving, all of these sorts of things. And we didn't change the drunk driving laws. We didn't throw up our hands at it and say, we ought to, okay, everybody, if you have 2 drinks, it's okay. No, we mounted a massive, long-term public education campaign to educate people that it is dangerous and it's illegal. People don't do it anymore. Nobody drives without putting their seatbelt on anymore. I'm not saying that this is exactly the same thing, but what I'm saying is that you're faced with a problem like this. You can either change the norms and change the standards and risk the threat to the creative community and the jobs that depend on it. Or you can say, this is a new phenomenon that we have to do something about it, and a key component is education. That's why the campaign against drunk driving is succeeding.
What would you like? I mean, what's the end goal then? I mean, is it just money to be spent on public education about this?
Well, I think the end goal here is that all of us who believe in the creative community, whether it's for the pure enjoyment of seeing scripted movies and scripted entertainment, to say nothing of the men and women who work in those jobs, if you believe that that's valuable, if you believe that that's valuable and ought to be protected and ought to grow, then you ought to be part of this campaign to do something about online copyright infringement.
All right, a new Smokey the Bear for copyright infringement.
If it works.
Let's. I see questions in the audience.
Hi, Ben Dornberg from Public Knowledge. I had a question for the French gentleman and Ms. White. I was wondering how much of the energy behind international legislation was coming from the U.S. Essentially, like, are South Korea and Taiwan passing these systems to defend, the Taiwanese media industry, or are these, sort of coming from U.S. trade negotiations and Special 301s and that sort of thing?
Well, I'm not sure I understood the question. You are asking if the energy behind the bill was coming from the US? Kind of?
Yeah, is the energy, are these countries doing it primarily for domestic reasons, or is there, pressure or suggestions coming from the US?
Well, I wouldn't say so. I mean, the French media industry is very strong, and I mean, they have, they devised it by themselves, and with the help of a lot of French law professors, and of course there is like a global consensus between copyright owners, I think, that such a process should be enacted. But you see, it's not the same thing in UK, it's not the same thing in the US, it's complicated, it has to adapt to specific local laws. And on top of that, I don't think they all agree globally exactly on what it should be. And now, as I said, we begin to see strange byproducts of that kind of reasoning. So it will probably have to evolve again. But as for me, I wouldn't say that it was something that was imposed by the US, because basically I would say it benefits the French copyright owners.
Yes, in addition, I would say in France, the defense of the French culture is something very important, and I would say at all people in France are on this issue make something under the pressure of US, and maybe at the contrary, that the only concern is to defend, the main concern politically is to defend French culture. And all the creators, the French singers in movies, they are all in favor of this law. In a way, we could say that there are three groups. The first group is the group of creators, and they are in major. Maybe one or two guys are against, but they are in favor of the law. The second part is the neutral group, and the operators are part of this one, and they are just going to respect the law. And the other one are people coming from the internet community, maybe customers, and they just want to take profit of the lack of the law, and to take profit of what internet allows, and that's it. But the creator, the weight of the creator is politically very important in France.
It was controversial. I mean, I understand that it divided and was much debated for longer than many of the bills.
It was very controversial because between the internet community and the creators, they have a very different view. And the point is that it's totally unclear because I mentioned we understand that this business has passed from 1.5 billion to 900 million, and nobody knows exactly how to solve this the lack of business. But on the other side, there is a strong trend on internet usage, and you can make some barriers, but it's a dream. It's a virtual, because now people are using streaming, consuming streaming video, streaming music.
Okay. Go ahead, Jean-Baptiste.
Thing, because you know what's interesting in your question is that we cannot imagine that a solution to that problem could emerge locally without actually being some part of a global solution. The thing is that in France, we were speaking about the French case, but we should have been speaking about the European case, because a lot of the debate has been going to the European Parliament and to the European Commission, and their voice is beginning to be bigger and more articulate. Nelly Cross actually expressed herself on that, I think, 2 weeks ago. I don't remember exactly what she says, so I won't quote her. But you see, the thing is that we all know that this is a global problem. We are talking about internet, you see, not like the mail French system, the French mail system or something like that. But internet, when you download something, you can download it in China maybe, or maybe in the UK, or maybe in New Zealand, and it won't make a difference. But it will make a difference to the copyright owners, that's for sure, and it will make a difference to the public if they cannot do that kind of thing either. It's for sure too. And the interesting thing is that we had the same problems like 100 years ago with copyright at the time of Mark Twain and stuff like that. And Dickens famously complained that the US people actually did not, they were not enacting copyright laws, and so he was not paid, he was not being paid for his books in the US. What happened is that people just, from different countries, just got in the same room and began discussing and try to actually find a common solution between nations in order to find to know what to do. And it became what is called the Berne Convention, which dates back to, I think, 1888 or something. Maybe someone in the audience knows better than me.
Yes.
But it's all.
Let's get some more questions here. Go ahead.
It's September 9th, 1886.
Thank you.
Matt Shears with the Computer and Communications Industry Association. So when we hear about content protection schemes, and it could be the 3 strikes or it could be any other, there's sort of 2 types of justifications. One is we recognize that this protection scheme is going to tax a certain set of industries, but it's okay since we think it's going to sort of foster innovation and creativity. The other justification that we tend to hear, and I think I heard it today, is, well, this is going to cost X number of dollars, but it's going to save us, it's going to create, X plus Y. And it's that particular description or justification that I find very curious, because it suggests to me that there's money being left on the table, right? That if we could get this, this protection would only cost us $3 and it would earn us $10, my thinking is that should be a business opportunity, and that the rights holder constituency should be willing to pay for it. So if this is going to pay for itself, if that justification is being advanced, then why isn't it already happening, right? So, which then makes me think that perhaps the explanation is that those numbers aren't really good, right? That it's not going to pay for itself, that this is just a cost that we're putting on an industry. And so I guess my question is sort of what is the panel's thoughts as to which one of those 2 sets it is, and if there's any justification for that.
Reactions, Greg?
Yeah, a couple things. The American film industry spends millions of dollars every year, both to protect its content and to make it more widely available and to evolve its business offerings and to make it available on the internet. You may have issue with how quickly that's happening, but it is happening, it is occurring, and it is a remarkable and new and exciting field. As we've engaged with governments and we've engaged with ISPs around the world, we've recognized that this is not free, that there are costs associated with it. And we have been willing and are willing to pay our share of that cost. And we have spent a great deal of money trying to develop methods which enable us to detect infringements online and to ensure with several layers of verification and proof that when we ask an ISP to send a notice, that it is indeed an infringing activity. Because we don't want to be sending, we don't want to be giving speeding tickets to people that aren't speeding. So we take that very seriously. I guess what strikes me when I heard the question, and I don't mean to impugn a motive here or something, but what strikes me is that, like I was saying earlier, there are costs associated with enforcing drunk driving laws. We could probably save a lot of money in this country if we just didn't enforce them. If we didn't enforce speeding laws. But we believe that there's a greater social good and a greater economic good in doing that. And that's our point is, yes, there are costs associated with this, and there may indeed, as you suggested, be business opportunities for people to come in and fill that gap, see where they can make money on doing this. But, we're willing to pay our fair share of it, and we believe that, it returns in the end a positive outcome, both for us and both for the community at large.
One thing we haven't heard yet today, we've heard about, going after individual users, which has been sort of said, well, we tried that, didn't work out. The focus, of course, of this discussion has been intermediaries and the role of internet service providers. But a word and a phrase we haven't heard is technical protection measures and how effective those are or could be in dealing with infringement. Has the day of digital rights management passed, or is it still a viable component in the protection scheme? Any of our panelists have a reaction on that?
Well, in France, at least, and maybe probably in Europe, at European level, it seems so, because once you have such a law and you are effectively protected, well, it's complicated to actually at the same time, implement other uses. So kind of the deal is that there are even, that's kind of the deal, but there are even clauses in the law that specify that any technical measure should have to be interoperable and not harmful to competition and such things. So I don't remember exactly, because of course I'm not representing the Hadopi authority or anything like that, but it seems like the bargain is that they will go without the technical measures, but will have a stronger judicial protection.
Okay, great. We have a questions in the back here.
Hi, Tom Sidner. I just would, a question, I think, from Ms. White, and I would point out that in his 2004 book, Rampant Online Piracy, as the, quote, crack cocaine of broadband adoption. So I think, although enforcing copyrights online, if you wish to view it as a tax that benefits copyright holders at the expense of online service providers, we've certainly seen piracy effectively act as a tax on copyright owners that benefits online service providers. Maybe there's a nice way to meet in the middle. Ms. White, I was wondering, I think notice forward is a great idea. I'm very much in favor of it. At the end of the day, though, as long as it's voluntary, it does not provide a means of actually enforcing the rights. In other words, if people realize that the notice is just a notice, it doesn't really mean anything, doesn't mean anything will happen, I just don't see how in the long run it provides an entirely effective solution. Now, back in 2005, in the Grokster case, many American internet service providers, access providers, actually advocated suing their customers as a means of enforcing copyrights online. Since then, we've learned that technologies like Kazaa and such were really just basically piracy machines. Has there been any move to find some other way, by ISPs, to find some way of enforcing rights, not just notice forwarding, but enforcing rights that does not involve asking copyright owners to sue consumers?
Well, I think that service providers take the approach that, they don't want to do ongoing monitoring or blocking. I mean, not only is that technologically problematic, but it just raises a whole host of privacy issues. network neutrality issues, and I think it's not something that is their obligation completely. I think that the notice forwarding is one aspect of assisting with making the internet a safer place, but I think that any ongoing obligations, network filtering, things like that, just isn't going to work.
Yeah. Sydney, I want to build on something Jean-Baptiste said earlier, which is, would you feel more free to take an active role if there were such a regime as Hadopi here in the United States? I mean, how would that impact the notice forwarding regime we're currently operating
I think
under?
it would probably slow it down.
Why?
I think it would create unnecessary bureaucracy within the process that doesn't need to be micromanaged by government mandate. I think that clearly that notice forwarding has developed on its own through through private sector work. It's not something that the government has mandated.
Is there a bite at the end of the day? I mean, do your members cut off users after 3, 10 notices?
I'm not exactly certain about that. I couldn't really give you a definitive answer. I think that there has been discussion of doing temporary things in terms of slowing down the users' capacity and things like that.
Yeah. Gregory, do you have any insight into this process?
Well, I think one of the points that was made earlier in some of the work that we've done, as Sydney was saying, is that, if you look at what happens, the number of second notices, if you will, is dramatically lower than the number of first notices. So I think it says a couple of things. It says that a little bit of education goes a long way, which is a positive message. It may well be that you've got users who are doing this that aren't aware that the site that they go to is illegal. If you look at some of these sites, they look very polished, very legitimate. It could be that, I get a notice from my ISP that my daughter was doing it, and I put a stop to that. So there are a number of different things.
Okay. I got a question in the back, and I'd love to hear, Robin, think about this one. How's the UK working on this notice forwarding notion?
Chris Nam, Future Music Coalition. This may have been touched on before, but basically, given the fact that P2P, it seems, is not the real issue anymore, you've got all these illegal, not the Deezers and the Spotifys, but the illegal offsite streaming sites, offshore streaming and these sites in other countries. How, if anything, can Hadopi or the laws in Britain or wherever else go after and sort of, I don't know, how are they dealing with these sites?
Do you need to wait for people to bring actions, or can Hadopi go and take actions against sites, individuals that may be infringing?
Well, the thing is, I'm not sure I understand the question, because in the world of music in France, there is not, who's still downloading? Because you can have all the music you want on Deezer and Spotify and other websites very easily. So what's the point? The point is probably for people who want to put MP3 in their player. That's one thing, but they were not necessarily downloading at the time. They were more like exchanging with friends.
That's the point. But it seems so Deezer and Spotify. You're saying that, so those are legal, paid. They pay the licenses, but I mean, at least in the well, maybe I'm coming from the U.S. We don't have those sites, so people are accessing these streaming sites offshore, that are located in other countries, and yeah. Exactly. So how we presented a bill. I guess there's a bill. I'm not sure where it is right now. But to go after sites that are streaming, doing illegal streaming, and I don't know if this is a problem in Britain or a problem in France. But if that were the case, if people were going to sites with streaming music, movies that were not paying the licenses? Is there a way to, in the bill, to go after them?
Well, if they don't pay the licenses, they're copyright infringers. So if they're copyright infringers anyway, and they're not individuals. They are companies or whatever. So, I mean, it's not very difficult to go against them. And we had in the news a lot of announcement of big torrent sites being taken down, can I say, or something
Taken
like
down,
that?
sure.
Taken down. And so it's not the same problem at all. There is one thing, it's educating and punishing the individuals who do illegal copyright infringement. And another thing is going against like the big fish, the people who do it on a large scale and make a lot of money out of it. And it's not the same thing at all. And for the second part, I think we have all the tools we need. Or if we need new tools, well, then I think it won't be that difficult to get them.
Well, there's more copyright problems than one can solve or deal with in one breakfast. So we have had other breakfast discussions on the Leahy bill and ways to go after sites through different means. Robin, have you had a chance to think about the British, what's the state of the British ISPs and content holders, and where does it fit on the US-French scale here?
Well, I'll sort of come back also
Please.
to the question there about going beyond P2P, and certainly creative industries in the UK have said that about a third of the online illegal infringement is coming through things like sort of bit lockers and things like that. We haven't got measures in hand at the moment or regulations in place to tackle those, but we do have the reserve powers. We're concentrating at the moment on the P2P. But sort of any technical measures you do take against those or anything else, that you're going to have safeguards. I mean, is that material legitimately available? By cracking down on, imposing a technical solution, could you be having a negative impact on somebody else's legal activity? And so forth, and those are things that will have to be looked at later in the UK. On the notice forwarding, no, because we are in sort of early days, the emphasis is on copyright holders notifying ISPs and ISPs writing the letters out. Yes, there will be quite a few resources involved. We estimate those about £30 million, or up to £30 million, depending on how many copyright infringement notices copyright holders think they're going to be needing to make over the first couple of years, and we'll review those costs as they go on. And that,
okay,
that's probably
let's get some more questions here.
Stage.
Hi, Johanna Shelton with Google. I heard Mr. Fraser say essentially, trust me, we know what is infringing. And I listened to the UK and the French descriptions of their law, and what I'm wondering is where are the protections against abuse in terms of what is actually deemed infringing. And, you know, coming off of a recent election where at YouTube and in other places we've seen one campaign and one candidate use copyright against other candidates and other political parties, and coming off of other situations where we have one record label claiming thousands of songs that another record label is claiming. So I'm trying to understand what protections there are in there where, you know, maybe it's not Mr. Fraser's companies, but some other companies that try to use the system in anti-competitive ways. We have seen some of that, you know, a bathtub company trying to claim a copyright in all of the pictures of bathtubs anywhere on the internet. So could you please describe that?
As I tried to suggest, and perhaps didn't do as clearly as I should have, when we've looked at this problem, when we've worked with whether it's governments or with ISPs, we've tried to develop a system to verify that there is in fact an infringement taking place. And I know enough about it to know it's 5 or 6 different layers of verification. I'm not a technical expert to tell you and to tell the audience what all of those different checks are. As I indicated earlier, this system will work as long as everyone involved has got confidence in it, no different than anything else. We've got confidence in it, the ISPs have got confidence in it, the governments have got confidence in it, and most importantly, that the public has got confidence in it. So we do our best to design a system that is error-free, that we have confidence in, But we also recognize that there may well be mistakes. And so part and parcel of the systems that we talk to ISPs and governments about is, if there is a problem, if somebody gets a notice they think is unwarranted, unjustified, or just wrong, here is an adjudication process, whether it be done by email, whether it be done by calling a human being, what have you, to sort those out. The error rate in some of the what some of our companies do is actually remarkably low. It's under 0.5, 0.5%. So there are mistakes that are happening. It's human beings are doing it, so there are mistakes that are happening. But we do try to build in, if you will, a back-end process. And as you know, as the panelists, my colleagues have suggested, governments have recognized that this raises problems, and they've built in a government system, a government way to appeal that. So if somebody believes that they're aggrieved, that their internet service is cut off, they can go to a judicial, quasi-judicial body to have that complaint heard. And we've been supportive of that.
I think the key question we're still kind of wrestling around is what is needed to get to a place that you can graduate up the response chain, right? I mean, we've talked about a system, purely voluntary, ISPs and content holders in the United States. End of the day, question mark is, can it be effective, or do you need to go to a lawsuit?
I would say a couple of things. I think that, you know, all of us who've been in this debate for the last couple of years, here, in the private sector, around the world, have been operating, you know, we've done a great deal of research on what would you do, try to do research on how to design this as effectively as we can. But we really don't have a great deal of practical on-the-ground experience. We're getting that in France now. And we are engaged with trying to measure what is going on there before the Hadopi system takes place, and then what happens afterwards. Because there's nobody who wants to understand the effectiveness of that system more than we do. Because we don't want to be going to other governments and other people in the private sector and say, do this, without knowing that it works.
Mm-hmm. I think we have time for 2 more questions. So this hand right here.
My name is Todd Wiggins. I'm a local business owner and I'd say a bit of a YouTube fanatic, certainly a daily user. And I wanted to ask you, how does this figure into the picture? They seem to have their own implementation process for situations where there's music that's been used illegally, et cetera, and it seems to be quite effective, where they just basically cut you off if you're using something you shouldn't be using. So is that a model for how things could be implemented in the broad scale, or does that go against the grain, or does that seem to work as far as you know?
Anyone want to react to that? How about, I mean, by and large, is there contentment or lack of contentment with the private sector, whether it's a YouTube or a telecom company making the ultimate decision about takedown or cutting off somebody? Do you have any thoughts on that, Hervé or Sydney?
Well, I mean, I think you do have to make a distinction between a service provider, a telecom provider, a cable provider, versus some sort of, I guess you could call YouTube a marketplace in a way. I think that, you know, in a situation like that, they're going to be making a decision on a case-by-case basis. I mean, it's probably a lot, you know, it's a lot easier, and it's also not impacting that user's overall access to the internet, you know, beyond the actual infringing material.
Okay. Go ahead.
I would just say on the YouTube, you know, on UGC sites like YouTube and others around the world, you know, our companies have come together and tried to negotiate, whether it's YouTube or, like I said, UGC sites around the world, a set of principles by which, you know, business to business, private sector, no government involvement, where to try to prevent exactly the circumstance that you described. If there is infringing material on a site like that, it's removed. And so it is a private sector cooperative agreement, and actually it's been somewhat successful.
All right, let's
No,
go.
maybe I can add that in France there are more and more agreement between private sector in TV and companies like YouTube. In France, you have an equivalent of YouTube, which is Dailymotion, and it's a successful service. And they have done a lot of agreement now with the TV channels that define what they can use and what they can't use. And it's the frontier is not sometimes obvious to follow, but they try. We could say ideally, but that was effective. They are going to maybe to discover the future together and to try the best way to work in a win-win kind of win-win situation.
Thank you. Jillian Murch from BT. And in full disclosure, we clearly are working very closely with US or UK government and have some concerns with the Digital Economy Act. But you know, we've heard the number tossed around a lot about the negative impact of infringement on the creative industries, and there's been some insinuation in the room that the ISPs have some liability in that. And I'm just wondering, since we don't really know the costs, everyone's acknowledged that there's a cost to implementing these three-strike systems. What is the appropriate balance between what the ISP should pay for that and what the creative industries or the copyright holders should? I think in the current Digital Economy Act, the breakdown is 75% for the creative industries and 25% for the ISPs. Is that an appropriate balance? We don't know how much these things are going to cost. And I just wanted to get sort of the panel's reaction since the numbers are so unknown.
That is a great question on which to conclude. And let's hear from all of our panelists about this cost-benefit question.
Shall I kick off?
Sure, go ahead, Robin.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Yes, Jill, the split is in the UK, envisaged in the Digital Economy Act, is 75-25, with copyright holders paying 75% and ISPs providing 25%. When we look at the cost-benefit analysis, and if our studies say that by implementing this we'll save copyright holders about £200 million a year, and therefore the UK economy £200 million a year, then the estimated costs, which range between £12.5 million and £30 million, depending on the number of copyright infringements recorded, is clearly a very positive cost-benefit analysis. We do think that the copyright holders should pay the large proportion of that because of that, but we think that by charging by holding ISPs liable for some of the costs, it helps encourage the process to be lean and efficient. And ultimately, we don't want to sort of create a new industry all in itself. So that's the approach that the UK has taken. The Ofcom, the UK's regulator, is consulting at the moment on on what those individual costs will be, and those costs will be set initially from April next year for the first year, and then a second one-year period. And Ofcom will be reviewing those costs in advance of the second year to take account of what the usage has been, so there can be an aggregate sort of charging over the 2-year period.
Jean-Baptiste?
Yeah, I think of the cost, I gave a few numbers, so we know how much it costs. For the ISPs, maybe I'm wrong, so I'm not sure, but I think it resumes to €3 per connection. So the bill for people will increase of €3, which is a lot in France because the average bill is €30 a month for a big internet connection. But that's like the short-term cost. And the short-term benefit, well, is difficult to measure also because we already have a lot of other solutions, and actually it's pretty clear that the amount of people illegally downloading is decreasing, at least in the field of music. But then, what is the long-term cost? And as I said, we have a lot of strange things happening, with people actually realizing that they all sued together, that suddenly they have a government agency to talk to, that they can express their concern to them and maybe try to translate these concerns into effective law for their own good, you see. So it's really complicated, but it seems like the real cost will be like all the negotiation that will be going on for the next, 25 years maybe? Because it's not a finished thing, I think.
Okay. Greg?
I'm not sure what I could add to that. I mean, as I've tried to indicate earlier, we've recognized that there are costs on both sides of the equation, or maybe 3 sides of the stool here. There are costs that we incur and other content owners incur. There are costs on the ISPs, and there are costs to the government. We are looking for an equitable sharing of those costs and trying to do it as efficiently and as cost efficient as possible.
Thanks. Hervé, any final thoughts on our discussion generally?
The problem is in France, it says that ISP are requesting to pay more and more tax for everything, and we don't have a final model. For example, ISP are requesting to pay for the public TV now, and no, I would add just that we don't have the final model, and we know either we can add some tax or ask ISP to pay something. We are not going to recover the former turnover of the music market, and we know that, and that's a reality.
Sydney, last word.
I think it's important to also, in addition to looking at the cost, look at the benefits. I mean, if you have something like 3 strikes and you have a person cut off from service, a real serious infringer is just going to move on to another service provider. So, I mean, what real benefit are you even achieving by, your action against that person?
Well, that is the last word, but we will be speaking about intellectual property subjects at our next event, December 14th, China and intellectual property with Fu Liwen, the IP attaché from the Chinese embassy. Please also fill out your survey form. We do want your feedback on our series. We'll be back next month and the next month. And we also have the Broadband Breakfast Club next Tuesday, the 16th of November. Also, we want to thank each of you for being here and thank our sponsors, National Cable and Telecommunications Association and Public Knowledge, and of course, each of our panelists for making this a very informative event. Thank you.